how we think about the scope of these things on college campuses, what dialogue should look like, and then also along the why. I know you often think of this as a gate. How do we open gates to this? When do we not? How do we think about it? So I'll let you get started with those questions. I will note to everyone, this is an interactive conversation. What that means is that if you have a burning question, we'll go old school and say you can raise your hand, and we'll jump in right away for that. You can put questions over in the chat. But what we really want to do is have Ron speak to each of you and your questions as we go through this. So I'll turn it over to him. I'll be on the lookout for questions. Like I said, chat would work, or raise your hand either physically or with the emoji, I guess we call that, and we'll come to you. So Ron, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Vicky, and welcome to everyone. Glad you could be with us this afternoon. The honor is all mine. I love the opportunity to talk about these things and the opportunity to talk about them with the kind of people who would turn out on a Tuesday afternoon to discuss all of this. As an institution of higher learning, what are our obligations and opportunities? And I would want to add that they are not all obligations. Many of them are opportunities with regard to members of the community and their thinking and their sharing of their thoughts with each other. We know what we don't want. We all agree what we don't want. It's the ugly incidents that we have occasionally seen at various kinds of institutions around the country, some more notorious than others, possibly because of the visibility of the institution. We don't want anything that falls under the definition of the word heckle. We don't want heckling. We don't want the blocking of doors or the occupation of stages. We just had an instance of that journalistic event last week, or any other forms of disruption that act to prevent the appearance of an invited speaker, or that act to suppress the speech of participants in the event. But what is it that we do want? We know what we don't want. How do we define the scope and the nature of the dialogue that we do hope to foster on campus? Responding to any or all of those questions, I think, requires us to not only think about what we want to avoid, but what we want to make happen. And I think that's an individual responsibility as much as an institutional responsibility. In fact, I can't see how the institution would be able to make it happen without a personal commitment and personal energy of all of us concerned. So we've already mentioned this word gatekeeping. That's our keyword for today. And it's a metaphor for the task at hand, the idea that you open a gate and you also close a gate, and you monitor the degree to which that gate is open at any given point, and you care about who and what passes through. Now, again, it's a gate you want to open, you want it to be as wide as possible, but you also care about who and what passes through. The idea of a school, any school, but I think especially a university, is to be as wide a gate and as welcoming to the world as possible. That, I think, is fundamental. But as a person who is as much right as anyone else to feel beleaguered on this question, at Stanford University put it just a few weeks ago, the classroom is not a street corner. No classroom can be a place of learning without abiding by norms of civility and mutual respect. And if that applies to the classroom, it also applies to the campus overall and to the institution overall. Someone, or in fact, many someones, must take up the difficult and contradictory and confounding task of making this work. And we need to think about what we welcome, what we reach out and seek, and also right from the beginning, we need to think in advance about how we're going to limit that, presumably at the margins, presumably only under certain circumstances and hopefully in extremis, but that still might be a necessity to be imposed at the gate. We should be clear, we're not just talking about headliner speakers, but also about people invited to present to classes or other small groups. Universities are not unique in this exposure. There are other institutions that are subject to similar obligations and opportunities and cross pressures. So in my own personal experience, as Vicky said, I have been with NPR for about 25 years. Prior to that, I worked for various and sundry other kinds of news organizations, a very wonky Congressional Quarterly Weekly Report, a greatly less wonky USA Today, a metropolitan daily newspaper, a local television station, and so forth. So I've seen various ways that the media can be defined, especially because of their interest in the news. And I think that we'd have to say that the media over that period of time have been very much confronted with a constant gatekeeping challenge. On the one hand, you have the ideal of a news organization that was set out by Adolph Oakes back in the 1800s. When he bought the New York Times, he said he wanted all of it. He wanted everything. Give me everything, and then we'll whittle it down. All the news that's fit to print still runs on the top of that newspaper, but it has to be counterposed against. Well, I mean, it has to be counterposed against who's defining what's fit to print. Voracious appetite on the one hand, and yet this concept of something having fitness, of what is fit and what is not. Historically, news organizations tried to make some sort of a distinction between what they called news and what they called editorials. It's a distinction that is almost completely opaque to the world in general, but there was a page for news and there was a page for editorials, sometimes referred to as the publisher's page. And that is indeed what it was, by and large. It was the opinion of the publisher expressed through an editorial board. And that, I think, is primarily a newspaper institution, but we saw it to some degree in magazines as well. And then it was carried over in one form or another into broadcasting. Some of you may remember hearing the words, and now with an opposing view, and then another person would be brought on to take something of an opposing view, but always within a certain context. As I say, that was a concept little understood outside of the institutions of the media, and perhaps honored only in the breach. Then we got this concept of an op-ed page. You've probably heard that particular expression. Many of you have doubtless written op-eds already. Literally a page that ran opposite the official editorials, and it was supposed to feature, well, something that wasn't the newspaper's own point of view, the publisher's own point of view. And we saw versions of this in magazines as well. Long before Fox News appropriated the phrase fair and balanced, that was supposed to be the value that was expressed by this op-ed page. And it was also imposed to some degree on broadcast news as a condition of people getting their licenses to operate those highly lucrative properties. So media organizations have much this same desire to have the gate be as wide as possible because they want as large an audience as possible. For commercial publishers and broadcasters, that translates into advertising dollars. And even public media, I can attest, must show audience numbers to attract various ways of financing themselves, whether it's government money or private support. And whatever size audience is appropriate or necessary for their survival, the attraction and retention of that audience is existential. So have that gate as wide as possible, and then worry about what might be coming through the gate in terms of who and in terms of what. That's a tension that these organizations all live with all the time. And it should be obvious that managing that tension is problematic for the media. That is to say, failed as a task as often as succeeded. And cultural programming has a similar potential for cultural programming apart from the news has, and I'm defining cultural to include entertaining. Cultural and entertaining program has a similar potential both for attracting audiences and potentially offending them and causing problems.
So I'm gonna push on that a little bit about this comparison between the media and higher ed, because I find it interesting about the seeking out of separate opinions, and then what we see go on campuses where if we don't have an op-ed page, right? And so what that means is that sometimes others are responsible for adding in that other side or bringing that other side to the forefront. And so how do you think about that translation from the acts that you're talking about, media, to widen the gate and get those voices heard, versus how we might use that as a method on campus? What could we do on campus to do those things that the media are doing through op-ed pages and point counterpoints and those types of activities?
Yes, and let me emphasize that I don't think that this has ever been perfected in any respect. it is a gesture. I think it's a gesture in good faith, and sometimes I think it has done some good. But it mostly is an effort to keep the gate as wide as possible and not have to be too responsible for the negative consequences of who might come through. So what lesson is that, and is there for us? I've tried experimenting with something. This is a benefit of Canvas to some degree, to putting things in Canvas under a section called pushback. And it can be an invitation to student feedback, student disagreement, either by name or anonymously. And I also put things in there that contradict the textbooks to some degree, that contradict the viewpoints that are primarily being presented to them by my curriculum. And I think that has, well, I certainly don't think it's been transformative, but I think it may have had the beginnings of a positive effect in that people at least see that I recognize that there are people who see populism entirely different from the material that they've been reading in my assignments. For example, and this is possibly something that we could institutionalize, although I probably would vote against anything really strictly institutionalizing it. I would say it's a thought, it's a possibility that when presenting a certain amount of material in a course, we try to include in the curriculum something that is somewhat at odds with it. And I'm sure for many of you who teach, that's something you've been doing for many years, but I've really only been experimenting with it since COVID, really, quite frankly, because of the opportunities of putting things on Canvas very quickly and easily and showing them to everyone. Also, I think when we put on programs, when we have speakers, when we have controversial speakers, as much as we can, we should pair them, at least in the planning, if not necessarily in the presentation. I mean, I would love to have, two wildly opposed people at the same time. I think that's, it makes great radio, as we say, but it would also, I think, be a benefit for us. It's not always easy to get people to do that because they would prefer to present on their own. For example, Jonah Goldberg, whom we had for one of our programs a little earlier this year, I think he'd be game to take on just about anyone you wanted to bring on and have the two of them have a kind of debate. I don't necessarily love that word debate, but have them have a discussion. And we would clearly be getting different points of view, not every point of view, but different ones. And that is one place to begin. If you can't get the speakers to do that, at least have, say, a series of speakers in which it's clear there are going to be opposing points of view, so that it is not, in some sense or another, subtly or not so subtly telling the students that this one particular speaker is the only speaker, that this is the only person with something to say.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Ron and I will remember that a few years ago, we tried to get two people to appear together to give them an award for their bipartisan behavior, and only one of the two people would appear to receive an award on bipartisanship. So yeah, sometimes that is really hard. Great question over in the chat. The way this ideal of objectivity has played out in the media, though, in political coverage, is that often we see or hear a quote from a Republican and a quote from a Democrat, and that is considered balance, right? You got one here, one from this side, one from that side. But it is utterly unhelpful for the audience, well said, without any check on the truth of the claims. And is there a way to even do that better? I think you probably will have ideas, but how do we do that better?
We in academia should consider it absolutely necessary that we do better. I know why the media cop out by doing the one side, he said, she said sort of approach. Well, we heard from this person, but we also heard from that person, therefore we did our job. Next, show up. I understand why that happens. It is much easier to call that fair and balanced than to actually try to ascertain the truth of the matter. And to be practical, the media are not going to have the time, the focus, the background, the information, and the energy, really, the energy to try to ascertain what the truth is in a situation. Now, the very best journalists, the very best interrogators will try to do that. They'll say, but wait, is that really true? Can you point to some evidence? They'll push back in the course of an interview, and they will try to arrive at something other than just a he said, she said. It can be done, but as a practical matter, I would not expect it to be done very often in most news organizations, at least not in the experience that I've had so far. This is where the higher obligation in my mind, the grander obligation of the university community, college community, schools, really plays a role. We should be advocating a kind of forensic attitude towards claims and a constant critical attitude towards claims that does not just look for another point of view, as I was saying a moment ago in the pushback section, it's just another point of view, but actually tries to then go a step further and arrive at something that could be called objectively, demonstrably, evidentially true. I know that word true is, that word truth takes us into a whole nother realm to some degree, but I think we can get a little closer to agreement if we settle for fact. Just those four letters are easier to deal with than TRUE.
So I think that we've learned, like, this comparison to media has been helpful, right? And has let us learn some ways it's done there, some way we might do it. But what about other institutions? Where else might we seek some level of understanding about these bounds and the scope at which we seek to have dialogue on campus? Where else do we see this practice going on that we might learn from other institutions?
Well, I'm going to reach a little further even than comparisons to the media and talk a little bit about religious organizations. Religious organizations are rarely thought of in the same terms as media organizations, but they have certain things in common. They depend on audiences. They don't call them that. They might call them congregants or the people in the pews, participants, believers, ultimately donors. But to get those people, to get those congregants, and here I'm going to probably use the word churches just sort of loosely, but I think this applies ecumenically across many lines. But I'll just use the word churches. I'm more familiar with that from my own personal experience. Many religious institutions do widen their gates or advertise their gates as being wide. They like to put out the welcome mat. They proselytize. And in fact, some religious faiths span the globe, searching for people that they can convert. But while aspects of that outreach can get pretty intense, the process has another phase. And their criteria are involved, and there is a sense of belonging to the community by buying into the community in a belief sense. So there are creeds and there are other credentials that matter. So this is, if you will, yet a different pole away from the university concept that I think does have some potential lessons for us. So in the religious organizations that I've been familiar with, and that's a few, heterodoxy may be tolerated, but it is rarely encouraged. And those who push the boundaries too far challenge the institution and typically face some sort of discipline up to the point of expulsion. Even congregationally organized churches that disagree about everything from their daycare center to their interior decorating to their theology try in some way or another to effectively manage those situations so as to have something of a big tent, but so as to also prevent schism and also to have some degree of insistence on what makes a church, as we oftentimes talk about what a university exists to be. Some kinds of institutions of higher learning, of course, as we all know, are more inclined to this kind of gatekeeping where there's an orthodoxy and then there is discussion about the orthodoxy. Obviously, church-affiliated schools strike a balance of their own, and military academies and so on. But it can also be said of schools that are far from being religiously affiliated and far from being military. Schools can get a reputation for having a general view of the world, and in many cases that is based in reality, and they in fact have a certain view of the world. And it can seem to the students or other people who are regarding the university, whether it be the parents or it be the general public or potential students, prospective students, it may seem as though that reputation for what that particular university holds high looms very large and becomes their impression of the school, especially if they never actually go there. And of course, most of the people, whoever will talk about American University, will never set foot on campus, whether they're talking about it in the media or in other schools. So we want to be able to project something of who we are, but we don't want to verge into being the kind of institution where a particular view of the world is required And yet, there are ways of thinking. We made a reference to this a little earlier, is critical thinking and so forth. There are ways of thinking that I believe we do have a right to insist on. And just as we have a right to insist on some kinds of guidelines and guardrails for guaranteeing civility and acceptance and diversity of viewpoint.
I'm going to come back to preventing schism, but I want to go to the question that Nathan raised in the chat. Of course, not everything at issue is empirical or fact-based. It is not as though each assertion is provable, as we know. Many express values or preferences or predictions and so on. Michael Serres expressly chose not to refute another scholar. Instead, he would add, there's another way to look at this. No fact checker needed in those instances. The one thing you may not do is what he called umbilical thinking, as though one already knows the only right answer. The objective is not always to close around truth, but instead to open up to alternative possibilities. I think that's a great statement, if not a question, but I think it does say, how can we approach that in a classroom, and think about always being able to open the door to other possibilities while not forgoing this critical thinking. And as my good friend Lara always says, not accepting that 2 + 2 indeed equals 5, but saying, no, we know that not to be true, but how else might we think about a question? Any ideas there or suggestions based on that statement?
Well, I certainly wouldn't try to offer much from the world of journalism, because there I think we really genuinely do fall down when it comes to trying to find anything beyond a demonstrable fact. If we can at least agree on that, which is, God knows, extremely difficult. If we can at least agree on that, it's the rare media organization that wants to go much beyond that in terms of really dictating truth or trying to have some sort of larger meaning. And as the question so correctly states, there are many questions that do not reduce to a demonstrable fact-checking, and those are perhaps the most important questions from the standpoint of a university or from the standpoint of our shared life. So all of these things that we're talking about, other institutions, different experiences that other kinds of institutions have had, to me, reduced to a setting up of a certain tension, a tension in which we acknowledge that we have somewhat contradictory goals, that we have two things to do that in a very real sense contradict each other. You know, the wider and the limitation, also the sense of welcoming dissent in a classroom, but not descending to the point where students walk away and say, I don't know what to think, or I don't know how to think, or I don't know what the professor wants me to say. I'm sure you've all had that experience. Somebody will say, well, what's the right answer? Or what's going to be on the test? What should I be saying about this on the test? And just before we began, Laura and I we're talking about the quotation from the poet Rilke, learn to love the questions. And I like that idea. It doesn't work as well necessarily with undergraduates, perhaps, because they do have a sense of needing to have the answers. But if you can give them a sense of the tension, if you can give them a sense that there is a tension between this and that the answer lies where you find it in between, certainly some students are going to respond to that, and perhaps we can work with the rest.
So you made this great comment when you were talking about religious organizations, which are something I have some experience in also. And this idea that preventing a schism, trying to keep it all together, is an action, and a goal is to prevent the splits and the splintering. Is that a similar goal we have in higher ed? Is that what we're doing on our campuses? To what extent does this notion that we can't let schism or we can't let disagreement happen or get out of control really setting bounds on the dialogue on a university campus? Or do you think it's something else that has us, sitting in a place of almost fear of getting this ball rolling too fast?
I think we have rabbit ears as an institution. We feel vulnerable. We feel as though someone's about to in some sense or another, ding us for our behavior in this regard and in other regards. And this is a really important one. I mean, I would elevate it above, say, whether or not we park in the neighborhood too much or those sorts of controversy. This is existential for a university to be able to say, we are the home of ideas, we are the home of discussion of ideas, we are the home of heterodoxy. We want a big tent, but in order to have that, in order to achieve that ideal, we have to have some restraint. Now, ideally, it's all self-restraint. Ideally, we may have to go a little beyond that to show our appreciation for other people's ideas, while also asking them to restrain themselves. I think we need to teach that value. I think we have to model that value, which is hard. And we also need to teach it directly, perhaps as part of, and this is something I expect we'll talk about these 2 days, what very practical things can we do? Can we give people a guide when they begin teaching? Can we give people a guide when they matriculate, saying, this is how we expect you to respect the other members of this community and what you can expect them to give you in return. These are our values. And in a sense, institutionalize it as we individualize it.
I want others to feel free to ask questions, raise hands. To what degree is this about weeding out controversial individuals or not having certain speakers or limiting certain speakers? How much of this is about doing those type of activities versus the other side, and being setting the scopes of dialogue and how we practice and skill it as a community?
Yeah, I think a great deal of this has to do with our impulses. Why are we doing it? Why are we tempted to ask a certain person to speak? Is it because we think they have something to contribute? Or are we trying to draw attention to our campus, or more likely to a group on campus that wants to assert itself by bringing in someone it knows will generate a certain amount of controversy? What is the purpose? I'll give you an example that I was uncomfortable with. For example, a professor, not an SPA, invited Jack Abramoff, the disgraced lobbyist who actually went to prison for his corruptive activities 15 years ago or so. And not the actors who have played him in the movie, but the actual guy, Jack Abramoff, came in and talked to a class at AU. And the class was held in Mary Graydon's center so that it wouldn't, cast any sort of aspersions on any individual program or school. And I went because I wanted to hear from him, and I also wanted to see how it went down as an academic experience and as a moment in the political life of Washington, D.C. Jack Abramoff is lecturing at American University. Yeah, you can see the story, right? You can hear it on the radio. You can see it on cable news, and it was handled very well. It was presented in an entirely academic way, the way you would present any other historical figure of controversy, and wasn't made out to be a monster. Was given an opportunity to state his case, and students were given a free rein to ask questions, and he had a pretty candid interchange with them. And I thought overall it was an excellent educational experience. I can see why people would have problems with it. I can see why it was spiky, and I can understand why they were battening it in every way they could. But at the same time, in the end, I thought it was valuable. Much less controversial, was having people like Karl Rove, Kennedy Political Union had Karl Rove a while back, and there were some people who protested and said we shouldn't be having, the guy who got us a president who was a war criminal and so on. Okay, I mean, I understand that criticism. I certainly understand where some people are coming from with respect to that, but I still think that the balance of values is that you want that person and you want to treat them with respect, and you want to discourage people from making a fuss about it. And in the end, there wasn't really much. And I thought that too was a valuable political and educational experience for the people involved. Same group had Beto O'Rourke. I mean, there have been lots of people from all across political, well, I shouldn't say all across the political spectrum, because that's another point to discuss here. Is there a cutoff? And I believe there is. I mean, I would not personally, I would not invite David Duke to come to the campus. And I think that a university has a right to say that certain individuals, not so much for their ideas as for their provocative activities, are not buying into our mission and are not willing to cooperate even minimally with our values. So I do think that there is a cutoff point. I would not invite David Duke, and there are others, obviously, I would not invite as well.
I can't help but believe that there's probably not some questions from our audience around this idea of who and who not, David Duke being an example. I'd love to hear if people have questions on this or want to have an exchange with Ron about this idea of who comes on campus and who speaks and what it is. You mentioned, treated respectfully. I'd be curious around the definitions of that, questions people might have. And we've also used the word civil a couple times, and those are always interesting things to talk about. Professor Niehaus, you have the floor.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about this idea of, and I probably didn't get your wording right, so I apologize for that. But Ron, you were saying we don't want students to like put up a fuss about controversial speakers, but I'm not so sure that that's true, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we don't want students engaging in violence, right? But I kind of do want students putting up a fuss, right? Isn't that the exact kind of civic engagement? You bring someone speaking on campus, you strongly disagree with them, yeah, put up a fuss. So like where, and I imagine that you would probably agree at least in part with that. So I'm wondering where you see that line, like where is putting up a fuss actually good and where does it cross the line, and how do we figure that out?
Well, Beth, you didn't have a problem getting my wording right. I had a problem getting my wording right. I think that the word fuss was my attempt to duck the question. Because fuss sounds like nothing. It sounds like a fussy baby. I guess the distinction I would make is between objecting and attempting to prevent. That if the objection to a particular speaker extends to making it impossible for that speaker to speak, either by blockade or by heckling or what have you, that I think violates the norms, the standards that I think the university has a right to not only promote, but to insist on with organizations using the university's space, physical facilities, and name, most importantly. And so that I think is just in the right of the school to do. Now, what's a fuss and what's more? That obviously can probably have to be in the eye of the beholder to some degree. If it's disruptive, if it prevents the event from happening, that is, in my opinion, violative. But that if people want to object before the event, if people want to boycott the event, if people want to picket the event, if they want to hold up a sign but let people into the event, there's a big difference between picketing and blockading. It's an enormous difference. It's a hugely significant difference. And that, I think, is one we could live with. I certainly wouldn't say that there couldn't be objections raised in, say, editorials in the Eagle or letters to the Eagle or people holding up signs. That kind of fuss, I think, is entirely tolerable and to some degree probably welcome on the part of the speakers, because they, generally speaking, people that are controversial enough to be invited on campus are probably not all that unhappy about being controversial. I know they like to be noticed. Let's put it that way.
I love Nathan offering the heckler's veto, because I think that's the distinction here we're making between shutting something down and protesting it. John Wilson poses a really interesting question, Ron, for your comment about David Duke and saying that you wouldn't invite David Duke. But would you say that the university should ban anyone else from inviting David Duke? And which approach are you supporting here? What you wouldn't do versus what you would allow someone else to do?
Right. Well, I'm not accustomed to speaking for the university, but
Good choice.
anything that I would not do for my class, I suppose if I were sitting in a meeting discussing whether we should do it for the campus, that same viewpoint would be foremost for me, that something that I would not promote in my class would be something that I would be unhappy about promoting as a university, again, because I know just how rapidly the impression spreads from something like this, from allowing a speaker to, in some sense or another, endorsing a speaker. That is how the general world perceives these things. So I think that's a concern, and the university needs to bring that in. Now, again, I could imagine having a panel of people or a series of speakers that spanned, a wide spectrum, and that would conceivably include David Duke, who, generally speaking, as an individual, does behave himself in public, and it's not as though he's going to set fire to things. But if you had his point of view with others, that I think the university might be able to tolerate. What I would not like to see is organizations that invite such speakers in order to raise their own profile and to be provocative, and thereby change the temperature, change the atmosphere, change the mission, I would say, of the university as a whole, hijack it to some degree.
Lara poses a good question in the chat about the significance that we attach to a speaker and having it, like you just said, the universities having a headliner to reflect something about themselves or to draw attention. It's interesting that how much attention that does get and how much that reverberates around a community when you invite said speaker. But what about the fact that the similar speakers or writers may be assigned in class, and that they, we are having those ideas discussed in our classrooms via readings, but the speaker the invitation to speak drawing a difference? What do you make of those two different items, and are they just the same, and one is on a stage and one is in the readings we do, or is there something distinctly different about them?
I feel as though there's something distinctly different. That's my impulse. That's my sort of knee-jerk response. I would want to think more carefully about it before trying to frame a really good answer, but I would say that the written word, the experience of reading a written word is one kind of encounter, and that having someone on campus with all the attendant brouhaha that comes with it and all of the attendant potential damage that comes with it simply does not attach. Now, I understand there are people in political power who think that having books that talk about ideas in a library or in a school curriculum is the same thing as promoting them. I don't see it that way, because I just think that our culture has evolved past that point by and large. We know that there are books in the library we don't all love. We know that there are going to be parts of history that some people don't want to hear about and other people need to hear about. So I think most of the culture has evolved beyond that point. But I think we still have a right to talk about action, and a speech is an action. A speech is an act as much as just an idea. And there are lots of people present. It is a group event. It is a public event. And I mean, look, in terms of private events, invite whomever you want to, come to a dinner party. But if you're using the facilities, you're on campus, you are associating yourself with an institution, then I think you have other obligations to think about the impact and the effect that it has. And that's not the same as saying in your curriculum that you want people to read, Thomas Aquinas on one hand, and I won't even try to think of an equivalent person that would be objectionable on the far side of that. I think you can assign books and ideas and words on paper without the same set of criteria as I would apply to these public events.
Interesting. Other questions? Ideas? Rebukes, I always say. I always ask for rebukes. I think
I have a question.
Please.
Sorry.
go ahead.
Sorry, it's Richard Carroll. I'm an adjunct in the School of Public Affairs.
Thank you.
One of the things you see a lot on, I don't know, TV, if you want to get access to a good, maybe a famous person, you were just talking about high level or famous guests. And the tendency is to kind of treat them, with so much deference that, they're oftentimes not held accountable. Might be interesting to hear what you have to say about kind of walking that fine line between holding a speaker accountable for what they're saying, but at the same time, not discouraging people from for coming to the university and speaking or talking on TV or maybe NPR or wherever it might be. I've heard this referred to as access journalism. Like you just let the speaker say what they've come to say, but not really, undergo some scrutiny or some accountability. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh my, yes. One of the things that is a reality in the media and certainly in the news business is the idea of a get, G-E-T. Certain person is a get. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a get, if you follow my meaning. She generates a lot of emotional reaction. She generates a lot of attention. You see her picture. If you spend any time on social media, you see people talking about her. If I were Kevin McCarthy, I think I would feel troubled by the fact that more people know her name than know mine, when Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker of the House, after all. And that kind of media attention stems from that desire to maximize audience. And that when that's your paramount value and you don't think too much about what you're giving the audience once you've attracted them, and you're willing to do anything to attract them, then you do that kind of, call it access journalism. And in broadcasting, it's called a get. It's called a get. Who did you get? The show host comes in or the show anchor comes in and says, who am I talking to today? Who did you get? And that became the noun for guests of high interest that you might want to get again. And if this particular guest was a get once, they might be a get again. So yes, they get asked a somewhat more carefully chosen set of questions, so they'll come back. And there's no question about that. I like to think that we have as little of that at NPR as you're going to see anywhere. We finally got an interview with Donald Trump about a year or so ago, and Steve Inskeep, who is the most persistent requester of interview time in all of American journalism, had pestered the Trump people for years for an interview and finally got one, and Trump hung up, I think, about 45 seconds in, because Steve was not the sort of person who was going to ask softball questions. So when he could see that this was a tough interview, and when it was radio, and who listens to radio anyway, and I don't think Trump generally does, he simply hung up. So that was probably the right way for that to end. But most news organizations, and I shouldn't put this all on broadcast, but it is particularly true on broadcast, or cable as well, of course, and television, they live and die on that ability to get guests that people want to see on TV. And so a good booker is somebody who can book a good get. And that's a reality. It truly is. And among reporters, say on Capitol Hill, there are people who pretty quickly get notorious for being high access to the leaders. Now, I'm not talking about a guy like Manu Raju, who walks those halls, 24 hours a day, as far as I can tell, and nails people and asks the right questions and persists, and sometimes, gets cussed out right there in the hallway. Not that kind of access. I'm talking about the kind of access where the newsmaker calls the reporter and says, I've got a story for you, and expects that story to get very favorable treatment because of that access. I think that's more what you're talking about, Richard. Am I wrong?
No, that definitely is directly related to what I was after. I was just, I was also wondering whether to get the get, do they agree on not to cover certain areas that might be sensitive or embarrassing for the speaker, for the interviewee?
We have
Are
had,
there like a,
yeah, we've had some disagreements about that. Some of you may be familiar with a case where Mary Louise Kelly, one of our hosts on All Things Considered, got an interview with Mike Pompeo a couple of years ago, and he was under the impression she was not going to ask any questions about Ukraine, which at that time was not what it is today. This was before the Russian invasion. But she wanted to ask questions about Ukraine nonetheless, and Pompeo didn't want to talk about it. And when she did ask those questions, he got quite obstreperous and ended the interview, demanded she go into a side office to be berated by him, and showed her a map of Europe with no countries marked on it and said, "I'll bet you can't even find Ukraine on this map." And of course she did. And Mary Louise Kelly is not the person to mess with in that particular regard. And he then the next day put out a statement saying, and by the way, Bangladesh is not Ukraine. Now, okay, Mike Pompeo is a particular personality, but there are oftentimes sharp disagreements between the interviewee and the interviewer about what was agreed upon in advance. So it's probably best as journalistic practice, I don't think you would disagree, to not enter into any of that kind of pre-agreement. You can say, I'm there to ask questions about X, but not say, I won't ask questions about anything else.
So I want to go to John Wilson's comment and question in the chat, where he shares that his view is that we shouldn't have limitations. First of all, classes are different than extracurricular, like speaking events on campus. And he poses that we shouldn't set any limitations on this. And I don't know if he means any. I don't know if he would fall to the, like, if we can provide safety, and then we can talk about distinctions between physical safety, emotional safety, and all of that, which is another interesting conversation. But he's like, it shouldn't be about a gate ever closing on these things. It should be open to having those speakers. And I'm kind of curious, Ron, you've shared that you have a slightly different, I don't think slightly a different opinion on that, which I'd let you further talk about. But then others who might share John or share Ron's opinion on this and want to say something about that, because I do think there are those two distinct approaches that can be held in these circumstances about who we offer, the opportunity to be on campus and to speak.
Well, I'll just say that if I had to choose between gates that were stuck open and gates that were stuck closed, there would be no choice at all. The gates are there. Perhaps we shouldn't even have gates. Perhaps we should just dismantle the metaphor and say, these roads lead in to campus, y'all come. But I think we have competing responsibilities. And I agree the classroom is a different situation. And I think the classroom is much more a function of the individual professor or teacher's definition of the subject. Here again, somebody else is going to look over your shoulder, read your syllabus, say something about what's being taught at American University, but that's on a scale that is more personal and probably more manageable by individual faculty members. When we go on to these larger events that attract more attention for a variety of reasons, with a variety of agendas to attract attention, I think the university has a stake. I think that the School of Public Affairs would have a stake in who we chose to put forward, and the university does as well. That's not to say that only people who have been voted on by a unanimous vote of the faculty or something of that nature are allowable, but I think there is a tension. I think there's a tension there. But again, it's only the fact that gates do exist that makes it necessary for us to decide whether to keep them kind of open or kind of closed at a particular time. There is certainly the option of saying, look, we're just here in Massachusetts and Nebraska avenues, and we're really not putting up any kind of bar to any kind of point of view. And anybody who wants to come and set up a soapbox is welcome to present. And if you can get an invitation from 5 students, that's great. Get a room.
Which might be the hardest thing on this campus. Logan, I see your hand up.
Hi, Professor Elving. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Logan.
I'm wondering, what do you see as the role of a student? Like, you know, if the university invites someone to speak, and my friend's like, "Hey, Logan, this person is, you know, espousing things, and they're kind of they might not even think my identity should exist, and the purpose of their speech might be to try and get more people like me to not exist."
Hmm.
What do you see as a role of a student in like, how do you convince the student that they're wrong? I understand where they're coming from. So I guess, what do you like, how do students have that conversation?
One of the things in the Knight Foundation research into student attitudes about this is the distinct difference between different groups of students about who feels threatened and who feels that free speech is more likely to be directed against them. And they tend to be the people of either an identity, say a racial identity or a sexual orientation, who feel that they're vulnerable and they're threatened, or they tend to be people who have views that they perceive as being out of the mainstream. And those are two distinctly different groups of people. So I could imagine the scenario you described in talking to another student having to do with race, or having to do with gender identity, or having to do with somebody feeling as though they're not welcome on campus because they're a Trump supporter, or they're in some other sense out of step with the average AU student. And that would be true, I think, at many schools. It's not unique to AU. But I guess on an ideal level, let me throw out an ideal, since we're talking here about academics. The ideal would be that you would say to your friend, why don't we go listen? Why don't we go see? Why don't we go hear what this person has to say? And if you feel that what you're hearing is unacceptable to you, we'll leave. And I'm your friend, so I'll leave with you so you don't feel self-conscious about it. I don't want to isolate you, but let's just go see. Let's go find out. Certainly in terms of cultural events, I think we've all had the experience of people saying, I don't like ballet, or I don't like that kind of music. And you take somebody and they discover maybe there's something there they didn't know. This kind of business we're talking about now is different. It's not the same as strictly cultural events like a ballet or a music. But there are times when you go and hear a speaker you did not think you agreed with, or someone you thought did not want you to exist, and you find that there's a little more to it than that. And that might be a minority. That might be 1 time in 5 or 1 time in 10, but it's still a valuable experience. And I would be sorry to see the possibility of that experience eliminated. And a lot of it has to do with you. A lot of it has to do with how you relate to it as the friend. You can just, you can say, oh yeah, I understand, you know, do whatever. Or you can engage with them about it. You know, or you could make different friends. A lot of it has to do with how you react to their behavior in terms of trying to set a standard for what an AU student would do.
Logan, were you going to say more?
Can I just jump right in with one more follow-up question? Sure. Professor Elving, the value do you see, how would you explain that as like as a learning experience? Is it, listen, you might not agree with them, but now you know why you don't agree with them even more, and you can make your case to others? Or is it, oh, now I understand that people do feel this way, and if I want to be a change maker, this is something that I'm going to have to address? What specific value are you trying to get at?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and there are probably quite a few people on the call who could make this point better than I, but I believe that one of the values in legal education is that you're going to come up with your best arguments after you have heard your opponent's best arguments. That you can come up with good arguments on your own, but your arguments are going to be sharpened, and they're going to be refined and probably more powerful after you've heard somebody else with different ideas argue back at you. That's the educational value of an educational debate. And it's certainly a part of the skill set that professional advocates want to have. So I would try to make that case, not to say I'm taking you there to convert you, but I'm going there as someone who feels more like you, even though I don't feel specifically singled out by this offensive speech. But I feel more like you, and I would totally support you in refusing to go hear it. You don't want to be forced to go hear it. But I guess I would call it the check it out impulse. Just check it out, see what you think about it, know what it is you're reacting to. And then when somebody says to you, yeah, I've heard of him, you can say, I saw him, I heard him. This is what I think. It's a good way to gird yourself for further discussions of whatever is at hand.
So Logan, I think you bring up a really interesting question and some things that are happening in the chat about, you know, you were talking about the reporters who go back at the people they're interviewing or at least challenge them in the room next door, right? But I feel like students often have this learned deference. When we invite somebody to campus and we put them up on the stage, they either have this learned deference and or they at least think like I have to have kids gloves, or they see the example where students have actually, you know, had some kind of conduct violation because of their behavior at events. So I'm kind of curious if, you know, if there's no challenge to a speaker, how we think about, you know, the conversation you had with Logan, making sure that, you know, our students understand, you know, they have the skills to go in and question someone and not to give blind deference, but to be able to challenge them in a way that moves the conversation forward and creates dialogue. And we'll get to, somebody asked about dialogue versus debate, but what's our responsibility in that? So we aren't putting someone on a stage and saying, okay, everybody now have deference towards this individual.
It's, you know, it's hard to structure an event so as to give people a sense of what the best behavior is, because they're going to determine that on their own. I think just as a simple reminder, and again, this goes back to the suggestion that maybe we would have some sort of a, and this probably does exist, and I haven't paid enough attention to it, but some sort of an understood policy from the beginning that is pressed upon freshmen and first year people, and we say this is how we regard all of these things, and you will probably have an occasion in which you are unhappy about the appearance or the presence of some individual or another on the campus. And here's how we encourage you to react to that and, you know, share that, you know, viewpoint and so forth and so on. But these are the limitations that we think the university has a right to put in place. So, you know, I'm idealizing here in saying, Logan, by all means, you know, take that person by the scruff of the neck and get them down to, you know, and say, you've just got to look at this ugly, awful idea. And then you'll be better at arguing against it. I don't think that that's the right answer in every case, but I do think that there are gradations in all of those characterizations. There are going to be some ideas that are mildly objectionable, and those are the ones you should probably go hear and find out why it is you find them objectionable.
So someone poses, how do we draw the distinctions between dialogue and debate? And when do we promote one or the other? And what's the role of each? I think that's a really interesting question from the chat.
Well, I'll throw out a facile answer, and that is in debate, there is an implicit winner, which means there's an implicit loser.
Yeah.
And as in a court of law, you know, you can raise a lot of interesting ideas, but in the end, people want to hear from the jury and they want to know what's going to happen to the defendant. So I don't know why that's on my mind. The idea of a dialogue, it seems to me, is it sounds more like people just talking to each other, and maybe it's a little more formalized than a conversation. Maybe it's a little bit more thoughtful than just a conversation. But it's not a debate necessarily, because you're not going to have to get to the end and say, so did I convince you? Because you didn't convince me. You know, I won this argument. And I think it's fair to say that debate tends toward argument, whereas dialogue tends towards talk.
I agree. I always love it when Professor Schwartz-Lara points out that if you're listening to think about how you're going to win versus really listening to somebody instead of coming up with your next score point, I think that's really interesting. A question here about the tension between when we engage and have dialogue with folks expressing a point of view that we might not, or we might find offensive, versus when we decide that we're not going to engage them that in person and starve them from the attention they may be seeking. How do we weigh and trade those things off from when, you know, the approach should be engage them around an offensive idea versus let's, you know, that would be in and of itself fueling that idea or giving, you know, some air to that versus starving them that attention. And how do we think about that? I think that's really interesting.
That's a challenging question of degrees and gradation. It really is. I mean, if you're going to have pushback within your curriculum at you know, what is it, 60-40, 70-30, 80-20? You know, what's the ratio? What's the mix? And I can't imagine that there would be an answer that fit. I can't imagine there'd be one size that would fit all. It would need to be another one of those many instances where you have to impose a certain amount of judgment. You have to think about it and work towards what looks right and ask other people to give their opinion and ask the students, you know, what do you think? Do you feel like you're getting enough variety of viewpoint on these controversial questions? Or do you feel like we're introducing too much controversy where we should just be giving you the facts of the matter, you know, 50 states, this is the Electoral College, you know, what more do you need? I mean, some students would want that. Some students want to argue about everything. And then you've got the tension. Well, you've got the tension between those two poles, and then you've got all the people in between who are basically looking to us to make decisions of that kind.
And I think that's a tough question. I think one of the things coming back to Catherine poses here, again, this notion about this deference and what is a university really saying when we open our stage to someone on campus? How are we legitimizing that person through invitation, and how much concern should we have around that? I love your notion that you'd rather the gate be stuck open, which I agree with, but what kind of concerns do we have to weigh by having a person here? We're actually legitimizing whatever views they may hold or they may say up there, because I think it's a really I think it's a struggle from people in my role and others on campus.
One good way, I think, to tamper the deference, to tamper or to slightly, maybe not slightly, to present a different notion of presentation is to have an interlocutor of some kind, to have an interviewer, to have the presentation. I mentioned Karl Rove earlier, and that was the setup there. There was somebody to ask him questions and somebody to push back on his answers. That it seems to me, you still get you still get the sense that, hey, we got Karl Rove, you know, he was really an important guy, and that's good. I mean, there's anything wrong with getting people who have mattered in, you know, our national discourse, our national experience, but you don't want to let them just give you their spiel. You want to push back and you want to have somebody who, and here again, with deference, or deference is probably your word in this case, I would say something like respect. But Karl, you know, it kind of, you know, went south in Iraq, didn't it? You know, I mean, that was not a good thing. It was not a good process by which those decisions were made. There needs to be somebody on stage doing that, and not just later on in a bull session back at the dorm or in the next day. Then I think you really are in a very strong position to say, we brought this person to campus, but we did not necessarily let them simply, you know, hold forth.
I think Carlos,
that might be disrespectful in somebody's mind. They'll say, oh yeah, well, you know, you let these other folks, you know, say anything they wanted to, but you had to have somebody on stage to push back on Karl Rove. Well, you're not going to ever reach a point of total satisfaction. I think that's a step in the right direction.
and I think Carlos makes a great point about how commencement speakers kind of go above all that. Like, we do not challenge, there's no mechanism for, you know, unless there's a protest, right? People are leaving or standing up and turning backs. There's really no person on the stage that challenges a commencement speaker. And so I think that that needs to be thought about, right? I think that's a good point. Tom?
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Ron, and thanks, Lara, for putting this whole thing on. I just want to say on the issue of deference and thinking about controversial speakers. I mean, one question that is important for thinking about that we haven't brought to the surface is who's actually doing the choosing of the speaker and under what circumstances. So, for example, a speaker in a class, now a teacher, a faculty member in a classroom is somebody that the community trusts and has invested time and reputation and all the rest. And that goes along with a certain amount of obligation. And so if a teacher wanted to invite David Duke or something, there would be, there would be a conversation about that probably. You know, it is, I mean, at least as I understand AU's policy, that the First Amendment does not govern us because we're a private institution, unlike state colleges and universities. And so the people who can bring people onto campus are people who are recognized in one way or another by the community, either a faculty member or a student group, but a student group has to have a faculty member who is overseeing it. And so when we think about the speakers, we don't want to just think only about the content of the speaker. We also want to think about why do we allow that particular group to invite those people? And so if you think about a faculty member, partly it's because we trust faculty members to have good judgment, right? And if we don't trust them to have good judgment, maybe we shouldn't be in the business that we're in. And that there's something similar about student groups, that we think there's something useful about people making choices that in some cases may be mistakes. I think Lara and I have had a lot of conversations about this. There are things that could be done if a speaker was truly horrible. But I just think that remember, it's not simply the content of the speaker, it's who's doing it and why do we allow them to do it and under what circumstances do we allow them to do it. So that might be something to think about as well.
Yeah, and I think Catherine is kind of digging a little deeper into that too, again, about this notion of the invite being a signal of legitimacy, but then also how in the post-event world, this might be used by a speaker, or how they might talk about the fact that they spoke at X university, American, Georgetown, GW, whatever it might be, and how that is perceived. And that's a hard place to offer explanation, right? In the way that people then use their opportunity at a place. Catherine, did I get that? Or yeah, Catherine, go, because you'll say it better than I just said it.
Hi, sorry, I thought it would be helpful if I weighed in a little bit here. So
Perfect.
certainly, so I'm from University of Michigan, and again, also my many thanks to Lara for her excellent work in bringing us all together. So one of the things that we run into, right, is that, and I have seen this time and time again with speakers, after they speak at Michigan, they then will go on and say, and when I spoke at Michigan, as a means of conveying some sort of authority and legitimacy to their viewpoint. So, and we are a state institution, a public institution, so it's a little bit different for us. And going back to the question of who does the inviting, a student group can invite pretty much anybody they want to come to campus, and as long as they can get the room and the space, and the university will support that. And that includes folks like, you know, from the very far extreme right to the very far extreme left. As an institution, though, it's a question when we extend the invitation with which we have to wrestle because of this notion of conveying institutional authority. I don't know what the answers are. I do know that there is both strategic acceptance and strategic denial by folks on both sides of the aisle, but particularly on one side of the aisle, in terms of either not accepting invitations because they don't want to be associated with the institution, but then they say, oh, the institution never invites people of our particular political persuasion. But then there is this other issue of, well, I spoke at Michigan and therefore, I don't have any answers. That's why I was curious what other folks thought about sort of how to navigate to thread this needle.
Yes, I can just say, just as an addendum to that, it's very real in the media that if you have a guest and they're on your air for 30 seconds or 4 minutes or something of that nature, they will then in their literature say, or in their advertisement for their speaker bureau or whatever, they will advertise as heard on NPR, as though it were ex cathedra, you know, from NPR. And that's quite common and in other media as well. But whatever the media is, you know, as heard on Fox News, is a credential to much of the world. And to say, as seen in, you know, the New York Times, my God, you know, that's obviously an enormous credential.
I'd love to hear a little more about this Middlebury experience. We have, I think, is Jeannie talking about this concept of good faith dialogue. When you invite somebody that's coming to be in good faith dialogue versus somebody who might just be coming to stir controversy. I don't know the Middlebury example if somebody does, but how we think about that, you know, not coming in good faith, and how I think here a small group invited somebody highly controversial and stirred up issues and didn't have good faith dialogue. What do you do then? And it's, you know, it's a room for reaction at the moment, like, you know, in the moment of it. We saw Stanford, what went on there in the moment. What is an in the moment reaction that might be, you know, something for higher ed to consider?
I can speak to it, what happened. So I'm at Middlebury College, and this was actually before I got there. But basically a former governor who is some sort of like special advisor to the college, you know, one of these roles that are not really faculty, are not really staff, but like a distinguished scholar title, and a small group of students from the Young Republicans Club, and only part of it invited Charles Murray, who has connections to Middlebury. And this made national news, and there was a lot of controversy over how it was handled on both sides. But the larger issue was that it pretty much like ripped apart the campus. The atmosphere was very tense. Students were protesting, but also not feeling like there was a chance to have good faith dialogue with Murray. Murray had connections to the college of one kind or another. I think his kid went there or something. And so one of the things that ended up happening, and the pandemic kind of put the kibosh on this, but he was going to come back for by the same group, the same person. And we had this meeting where all of us kind of the community engagement, and it wasn't really good faith dialogue. The students were really trying to sort of own the libs in the conversation, especially around the table at this dinner. It was right before the campus shut down, March 2020. And there was not really this sort of like open dialogue, discussion of empathy, sort of what other people were saying, like Logan, about what students don't feel like their right to exist on campus, that wasn't being honored. And so, you know, sometimes, right, when people invite folks to campuses, like Milo Yiannopoulos is a good example, they're not doing it in good faith. And there isn't, and the sort of hiding behind free speech, it becomes this kind of challenge where, you know, yeah, in an absolute case, in a great world, in an idealistic setting, sure, we can have dialogue and engage with people who don't agree with us and come from a different political spectrum, et cetera. But when you're outing trans people, or you're telling people, saying things like people of color aren't as smart as white people, or whatever, you know, this becomes kind of a, I don't know, it's not just about a safe space, but like, what are institutions signaling by accepting that kind of hateful rhetoric on their campuses? And so, you know, and you can argue with the book, you know, and the premises of the bell curve and whatever, but fundamentally, I think, you know, the spirit of the invitation isn't really genuine. Yeah. So you guys can all Google all the stuff that happened after. And sorry to take a lot of time, but it was a complex situation, and one that I got to see play out again 2 years later. And I was like, why is this still happening?
Mm-hmm.
Beth offers, might we think about this idea of gatekeeping in a way that isn't about the content of the views, but it is in the spirit of good faith dialogue about important issues? I think that that's an interesting way to say it's not just about the views, but it's about the approach to actual dialogue.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think that is possibly a key, one of the ways that we can introduce this set of problems to students who might not have given it a great deal of thought in high school. But when they come to us, that might be just a way, or one of the ways that we could expand their thinking and make them think about it more as a matter of modes of interaction, modes of intellectual interchange. Some of it's going to be a little unpleasant. Some of it's going to be uncomfortable. Some of it might even be more than a little uncomfortable. And it might make you feel threatened. And we want not to exclude people from the community by those means, but we also feel that it's necessary for the university experience to have a very large definition. And let's talk. Does it destroy the university experience for you if somebody comes to campus whose ideas make you feel threatened? I mean, if that were happening every week, it certainly would. If it were happening every other week, it certainly would. If it happens once in a year, does that necessarily mean you don't belong at AU? That's the kind of question I would encourage people to ask themselves.
Beth? Bethany?
Yeah, so I was just reading John Wilson's comment in response, and so I wanted to, I don't have a fully formed comment here, but I think this is an interesting line of conversation around that gets at the question of like, what's the purpose of dialogue on campus, and what does that then mean about what it should look like? What are we striving for? And so I don't think that that I am saying we should ban speakers for any particular reason. There might be reasons why we would, but I think I'm generally against banning things. But I think we can engage with student groups around what's your goal in bringing this particular speaker? What are you trying to accomplish? Is this the way of accomplishing it? What's your goal with this particular event? What are you trying to accomplish? How is that fostering dialogue around this particular issue on campus? And so I just think there's a lot that we can do as educators to work with students and engage with students around some of these questions, and maybe have, statements of principles that aren't rules, aren't things that ban people from doing things, but say, like, this is what we strive for on this campus to foster dialogue around a lot of different issues, a lot of different perspectives, in a way that advances our knowledge, advances our understanding. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it does seem like there's something there that we have an obligation to help students develop, in terms of how are their actions, their student groups, their comments in class, whatever it is, contributing to a productive dialogue on campus.
I think they should get involved in what we're struggling with right now as soon as possible. From orientation on, that we should be asking these questions of them as well as of ourselves, and see what kind of answers we get. Be interesting. I'm constantly surprised, amazed, and I think generally positively impressed with what students come up with.
I like this comment about, and I don't think it's just administrators, maybe I'm saying that's an administrator, but that the role of faculty, administrators, others on campus, and thinking, helping students think through who they invite and what the intention around their invitation is, and how they may be, they may be seeing a get, but the speaker may also be seeing what they can get, right, from this conversation, and having eyes wide open about that. And how we think about it. And then also there's this comment from Logan about this whole idea about, should there be any obligation of the inviters to say why, or their intention around inviting the invitee, and giving, is that something that might be part of a request to have a speaker or something like that, which is an interesting way to think about it. Leslie?
Yeah, I've been trying to formulate my thoughts about this. I think I want to build on what Beth just said. I think sometimes we spend so much time trying to help our students navigate, you know, the questions of knowledge and, you know, we're missing an opportunity, I think, around culture shift about what it means to be in community and to be responsible to other people. And so I wonder sometimes if we start the conversation in a place that doesn't necessarily shift the culture or the thinking or the sense of belonging for certain students and others. So sometimes I wonder if the question was more about who do we want to be? You know, what sort of place do you want this to be? And keeping that in mind, the type of person that you want to invite, in what ways do they enhance that feeling, that sense, that, you know, that, and so some of that has to do with like citizen formation and some other conversations we need to be having with students about their responsibility and accountability in community. So anyway, it's just a thought that I keep wrestling with. I think sometimes we intellectualize this so much, and then, you know, the students that are hurt, who are coming to this place wanting it to be home, who maybe in fact are having experiences where they feel othered every day. So then the speaker just sort of is the capstone of like, I already don't feel like I belong. And now you all are elevating in a platform this person who just builds on that. So it's just some thoughts I'm wrestling with.
Well said. Maya? Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to build off that point, I do wonder, I think the point raised in the chat about context is really important here. I'm also thinking a lot about generations, and I think that across every generation, I think it would be fair to say there's a sense that like ideas matter, but I think for this particular generation, I think the sense of what ideas gain traction on social media platforms, in news media, in our broader culture, and the real, the very, very serious power that ideas can have, and the very, very serious implications that ideas can have, I think, in spending time with undergraduate students, feels at the very forefront of their mind. And I think that, and there are many, many schools of academic thought who would argue the same thing, and who do argue the same thing. And so I think in thinking about how we present ideas and how we take seriously the concern that some ideas, particularly in our current political context, have real consequences, I think that the point about context just can't be overstated. And I think that this broader sense of, you know, that some students, particularly students with marginalized identities, like experience that lack of belonging across many, many contexts in their lives, I think, you know, is an important part of this conversation, and something that I don't think is just because young people don't know how to talk about hard issues, but I think that they have a theory actually in many ways of how ideas impact the world that I think we need to take seriously.
And if folks have not seen it, there's a great comment from Catherine in the chat about the witnessing of violence around ideas and things in 2020 that we're kind of riffing off of here. Colin.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I just had a bigger picture question about how much weight we are placing on the role of these big public facing events to generate the mission of the university of being like an open space of free exchange of ideas. Because I just wonder if these big spaces are really like the best place for vulnerability or exposure from students. So you might have undergraduates who are like, I really disagree with that person's idea. I want to have a conversation about it. But a big event is really not the best place probably to be vulnerable in front of the entire campus to share why you think that perspective is hurtful or problematic. And I just wonder if we should be thinking as leaders in higher education of how to create alternative spaces on campus for these dialogues to happen. I mean, campus, the university has so many different types of spaces. I mean, there's the classroom, there's big events, there's dorms, there's your residence hall, there's the dining hall, there's a multiplicative number of types of spaces. And to put all of our, I'm not saying that we're doing this, but in a sense, to put all of our eggs in one basket of like the commencement speaker or the big public facing events as like the place where we showcase to students and the world what we're all about. I wonder how narrow that is, and how it just might be more productive in terms of learning how other types of spaces can be created and fostered to realize some of these goals. Because I mean, in a sense, trying to police what is heard in these big public events, you can hear all these ideas on the internet. The students can hear anything that they want to anywhere. And it's really hard to try and dictate what the ideas are in one confined space when the students are connected and they can hear anything anywhere. So I just wonder if we should be taking a step back from big public events, or putting more emphasis and more resources and weight into creating other spaces and opportunities. I don't know, it's just a bigger picture question to think of how we prioritize time, energy, and resource into what kinds of activities that we think are going to be most productive.
No, it's an excellent point, especially since we're talking about dialogue, right? And speakers are not the place that we drive dialogue in most cases. So great point, Colin. Catherine.
Yeah, first of all, Colin, thank you for that. We are actually thinking through that issue a lot, sort of what is the role of the big public speaker and what can we do then to riff off of that. I just wanted to also go back to the question, I think it was Leslie's comment about community. One of the learning moments that I really had in all of this is, and maybe this is something we've not talked about totally yet, is a need for getting out of our silos on our campuses. So when we at Michigan were going to host a presidential debate in 2020, we spent a lot of time working with student life and with counseling services, really pulling a team of people together from all elements, all sides of the university, to figure out how we could host this event, hear the voices of the people who were very concerned about being marginalized and attacked, provide systems, support systems for them, and at the same time, use it as a learning opportunity. And I think sometimes what happens, and my colleagues in student life have said this to me again and again and again, academics will bring somebody to campus and they don't realize that then what happens in the dorms are that these outside provocateurs come in and stir up and foment trouble in the dorms. And then suddenly you have ramifications happening in the spaces of the dorms and other spaces of student life far removed from the actual event itself. So that's just something, as we're all talking about sort of being administrators, faculty, inviting people and not thinking sort of cohesively, which kind of tackles, it goes on to the idea of community. But to Colin's point, what else can we do? How else can we leverage the resources of the university to think about dialogue and to think about these notions? A quasi-formed thought there, just to share.
No, I think an important one, and I note that Tom posted in the chat AU's freedom of expression policy that's new, and our statement of values, both or which were generated from a cross-campus effort that involved leadership from the academic side and student affairs. So I think that's another good way, and to your point, Catherine, that both sides have to understand the realities when these things happen and what people are facing. So excellent point there, and a great example of this work done well. Lara?
I just loved Colin's question and comment, and I think it really gets to why this convening has happened and is happening. The idea of, and I think Ron put this really well at the beginning, we know what we don't want, like shout downs, although a lot of what we don't want, it's about these big speaker events that if we work on campuses, we know those events are a very tiny part of what colleges do, and maybe not even one of the better ones. But this idea of, okay, well, how are we actually making the dialogue happen I do want to flag for people who hadn't decided yet whether they were coming tomorrow, that this question of like how to do this at the campus level and then how faculty can talk about how we do this and continue how we do this is the effort for tomorrow. But also just that this question of how to get the dialogue going, as people were talking about the various examples of speakers and how they would handle them and what they would think of them, whether it was David Duke or Charles Murray, it got me thinking that some of the best conversations that I've had with students about expressive freedom issues and campus dialogue issues were very similar in that we used fact patterns and I asked them to explore, what would you do in this instance and try and extrapolate it to a rule. And what I found is that oftentimes, not always, because I've had really excellent events where we bring people and it has an impact because it's interactive. But just that getting people to grapple with how hard a question this is about, what kind of speech can be on campus has, to me, it tends to, once I get students at least grappling with this question of how would you limit speech at all on campus, if at all, people tend to come away from that exercise with more of a view of I would rather counteract speech that's misinforming or hateful than limit it. But also with a greater degree of sort of empathy and understanding of what administrators and faculty are going through in curating our own offerings. So I kind of, I think one of the answers to that question, Colin, from my end, is getting people on campuses, whether they're our students or our colleagues, actually having conversations like this about how they would sort of value and address, speech and ideas in their communities.
Well, I want to give our speaker, Ron, a chance if he has any last minute thoughts, and then we'll wind down and get ready for the next session. But Ron, I want to turn it over to you.
Yes, I would just endorse the notion that the approach that we take to getting the kind of campus dialogue that we want needs to be as wide-ranging and cohesive as possible, that it should not focus on big name events. I started out with that because of some of the publicity that has attended some of the recent unfortunate incidents. But if there's a solution, it involves every individual as part of the community and probably getting as much of that understood as early in the beginning of an academic year or an academic era as we possibly can.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. Really appreciate everyone's interaction and great points and questions throughout this session.